Today on the Servant Leadership Podcast, we're joined by Dr. Henry Cloud, one of the most influential voices in leadership and psychology. For decades, he's coached top executives, advised Fortune 500 companies, and helped leaders navigate the toughest challenges that come with influence. Henry's books have transformed the way millions of people approach leadership, decision-making, and relationships. In this episode, Henry breaks down what separates great leaders from those who struggle, why trust is a leader's most valuable asset, and how setting the right boundaries creates space for what truly matters. He also uncovers the hidden patterns that keep people stuck and the mindset shifts that unlock real transformation. Henry, thank you for joining us on the Servant Leadership Podcast.
It's good to be with you.
Our audience has probably read your books or for sure been impacted by your books, but your journey to start writing is a very interesting journey. Can you talk our audience through how you even got into writing in the first place?
Do I write? I wasn't aware of that. It's not actually what I do. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And when I went knocking on doors for my first job, I got hired by a leadership consulting firm. And so this was kind of before, you have formal executive coaching and all this kind of big, industry you see now. But they noticed something. They noticed, they work with CEOs and teams and organizations, and they noticed that leaders sometimes had issues. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or not, but it happens. So they wanted a shrink in the house. And so, to work on their stuff and their interpersonal stuff, a lot of it, centered around their workspace. And I fell in love with leadership. And this was, I got something in my eye a second ago. I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation in leadership personality. And so from day one, I have had two parallel careers, one kind of in the clinical world and the other in the business leadership space, working with businesses. And, it wasn't too long into that before I discovered, you got this leadership development world over here because people, they're good at marketing or finance or something. Then all of a sudden they have two jobs. They're doing marketing, but also leading people. And that's its own science. And they had to get trained for a career that they weren't trained for, because leading people is a science of its own. And so they learn all this stuff, but then they go out there in reality and they find out they have to do it. And so that's when their issues get in the way. They got a direct report that's impossible, or a board member, or an investor. And so these interpersonal things get difficult. Getting people to do what you need them to do gets difficult. Go get a performance review from your board, and they say 9 good things and 1 bad things, and they lie up at night obsessing about the bad one. And so their issues affect leadership. So then they go to therapy. And so they go see a therapist and start talking about this, and the therapist goes, "Yes, I can see you're struggling in your job. Seems painful." Well, that's all our time for today. And and I'm a big proponent of therapy, but the problem is, in the business context, a lot of personal growth and therapeutic stuff doesn't understand the context of leaders and how they have to operate. So I started hanging out in this niche, kind of in between. It's really about how people perform and function, in an understanding of how humans are constructed in the context of, business performance. And so that's where I was coming from. Well, in that context, I was working with an organization and I was doing some trainings, some leadership trainings and development. And they said, where's this written down? We need to scale this around the world. I said, well, it's not written down. They go, well, we need you to write a book on it. And so, long story short, I said, I don't know how to write a book. And they literally hired a consultant to lock me up in a room with and sort of really teach me how to write a book, how to get it all in a book. And that's how I started. And so there was a section of my first book called Boundaries. The section was. And so go speak on it, and all the questions were about boundaries. So we decided, well, let's write a book on boundaries. And then that one sort of hit a nerve. And that kind of started the whole thing. And then I was writing a lot of personal growth stuff. And then years later, I had built a healthcare company and had treatment centers, hospital units, and about 45 markets in the Western United States, and ran that company for a long time, and then sold it when managed care started to change the industry. And at that point, I said, well, what do I really want to do? How do I want to spend my time? Because I could sort of do what I wanted at that point. And it was working with leaders and working with CEOs and their teams and businesses. And so I just set up a little boutique leadership consulting practice, but I never had published anything on the leadership side. I'd done a bunch of personal growth and relationship and, life's hurts and all of that. And so I wrote my first leadership book called Integrity, and New York Times got a hold of that and did this big spread on it and called it, the best book of the bunch that year. And all of a sudden, that started the leadership publishing kind of platform and brand, if you will. But I've never seen myself as a writer. That's not. I'm a practitioner, so I always say my work writes the books. At some point, I just need to type it. So that's kind of how I look at it.
I mean, over the years, you've worked with many of the best known leaders in the world. You coach so many leaders that people from our audience know. What separates great leaders from the average leader?
Who they are and how they're constructed. I mean, what we're talking about, if you take two computers, um, you can go down to whatever store and buy one, and it can be a great high performance computer that does most of what you need. But you get one of these supercomputers that does the crazy stuff. It's a different piece of equipment. Now, it does kind of all the same things, but it does it in a different way with different capacities. And so really it's not, it's really interesting. It doesn't come down, it's not about IQ or business background or education or how many MBAs somebody has, because when you get to the C-suite, all those people look the same, really, in terms of how, the smarts and the experience and the business acumen. But the great ones, you see this delta from where they are to what they create, and it's really how they're glued together, and that's where I've focused. Is the components. For leaders to lead people, they've got to lead people in the way that the people can follow them and the way that their brains can work. And so what I've always focused on is the psychology, neurology, physiology, anatomy of how people are constructed. So we're leading them in ways that they can actually perform, and in ways that makes them better than they would be if you weren't leading them. And to me, that's the difference. It's all about the person, how they're glued together.
When you're working with leaders at such a high level, are there common blind spots that you see that consistently come up that are hard for people to get over?
The biggest blind spot is to, and I don't mean this in any weird way, but the biggest blind spot is to really not know that you have blind spots. And And if you boil that down to the construct that runs it, it's when a leader's thinking and ways of operating is really a closed system. Now that doesn't mean they don't have people that they're interacting with. Obviously they do. They have multiple stakeholders gnawing at them all the time that they're feeding. But their reality of what they're doing and how they're doing it with whomever, they operate kind of in a closed system of who they are. And so I've got a Doberman, doorbell rings. She's wired to do a certain thing, and she just goes and does it. She runs to the door and barks, and the FedEx guy jumps in the bushes. It's like she's scary. But I've never seen her run to the front door and bark and then stop and go, I wonder if that was helpful. Did I bark loud enough? Did I bark at the right time? I wonder if that'll get me where I want to be on Thursday. She doesn't do that. And so that basic capacity to be able to open the system of who you are to the two factors that reverse entropy, to new intelligence and new energy from the outside that develops sort of, an observing, what we call an observing ego, where they are really, really beginning to be an open system for their own change. That's a big one, to realize that all of us operate out of our wiring, and until we get above the wiring and begin to see how it needs to be tweaked or what we're missing, then that's one of the big things that separate people, and that gets into how they utilize and develop the talent around them, and that's a big deal. And so that's why they hire coaches and others. It's just I have a saying: leaders will build their companies and teams in their own image. So if you're good at vision, you're going to have a visionary company. But what if you suck at structure and accountability? In fact, I was talking to the wife of an entrepreneur that started a big tech company a couple of years ago. And it just is like booming. But now that it's booming, they're at a precipice of trouble because he loves the boom and the deal and the creation and all of that. Really, really, really not good and bored at the weeds and the details and the operations. So the company has the weakness that he has. And so for leaders to understand how I'm wired has got some incredible strengths, but my company needs more than what I love to do or am good at. And they have to be the air traffic control to make sure the company is getting everything it needs to work. So that's a big one.
We talk a lot about servant leadership on this podcast, and I'd be curious to know, how would you describe servant leadership, and is there a place for it in great leaders, and how do you see it play out?
Well, it's a term that's been around for a long time, and in the beginning, it was great for people to wake up and say, "Oh, I'm not supposed to be beating people up," and this whole thing doesn't exist for me, and I'm not supposed to use people and throw them away. They're not all here to serve me, and all of a sudden people went, "Wow, I'd rather work for that guy." But it kind of a little bit, and this is a big deal, I think. It kind of got morphed into, at least the way people would hear it sometimes, that it it got morphed into almost a diminishing the leader's power and authority and um, really, in the good sense psychologically of the term, they're aggressive drives. You know, we humans have two basic drives. One is our relational drive to connect, and the other is our aggressive drive to move and structure and create and take things down a linear path. We call it results and relationships, right? And so you start talking about servant leadership, and it's sort of like uh, it can get a passivity, and it can get a diminishing the power that only that chair has of a position. True servant leadership, in the way that it's good, is it when somebody realizes the power of the chair that they possess is really the power of that chair is to serve the organization. And, it's like Ken Blanchard was probably one of the first that did this. He took the pyramid where you got the leader at the top and everything. And he said, you got to flip the pyramid. And where leadership serves the organization is a transcendent reality above them. And really, in my view, it gets down to it's really the ontology of the leader. Do I exist in an egocentric, somewhat self-centered reality, or do I exist? I wrote a book called Integrity about the way that integrated leader. Integrity means whole or to be integrated. It's more than just I don't lie, cheat, and steal. But the integrated leader is driven by something called an orientation to transcendence. And so it's not about just them and their interests, but it's about things that transcend their own interests. And they're able to give themselves to certain, to bigger things, including people. And because servant leadership is about serving the mission, it's about serving the stakeholders, it's about serving, the industry. It's not about me. But what you can't let servant membership do is castrate, the drive of, we need power in order to execute stuff, and position has power and influence has power. And so servant leadership is about the utilization of power in the service of things that transcend me. That's how I would look at it. It's not about being a wuss and, kind of, oh, whatever you want to do, kind of, let me get the coffee for you. Well, you're supposed to be at a board meeting. Yeah, but I want to be a servant leader. It's not about that. Not in the good ones. Now, that doesn't mean that the CEO wouldn't go get the receptionist coffee. That would be a normal human, non-self-centered, non-narcissistic thing to do. But we're here to serve. Why does this entity exist? Well, if it's just here to make somebody rich, then, go to Vegas. Who cares?
You bring up how Ken Blanchard kind of changed the way people view leadership and flipped the pyramid upside down. In almost every book you've had, maybe all of them, you've had such game-changing ideas that have shaped the way I think culture as a whole has viewed life. Maybe it started with boundaries.
I did that.
It feels like it. I don't think anyone has not heard of boundaries or necessary endings or integrity, just at least in the circles I run in. On the boundary side, why do you think leaders especially have such a hard time with boundaries? Because it seems simple, but it's not.
Well, boundaries if you take the pure construct itself, because the way I've always looked at everything is in my view, and as a person of faith, I don't believe all this just happened by accident. Anybody that you know, come on, look at the human body. There's a design to this thing, right? And so I believe that life and the universe and performance and functioning is constructed with an order to it. There's a created order, the way things work. And so I've always come um, at looking at anything, trying to understand. If you're going to build an airplane, you got to understand the laws of physics, and if you work with them, then things work well. And if you design an airplane that didn't ask that question, it's going to fall out of the sky. Well, leadership and performance is the same way, and there's a created order of how people function. Okay, so once you understand that, and we're talking about boundaries, everything that's alive, everything that has volition, everything that has, forward energy, executive functioning, all these things, everything that's alive exists with a dynamic tension of being part of something other than itself. Okay, where everything that's alive exists in relationship, because we have to draw life and all of that from outside of ourselves. So we exist in relationships. So, say two people get married. Okay, now there's this there's this entity. Well, everything that exists also that is a we there's two individual parties in that. So there's this property line that defines where one person ends and another person begins. It's like your house, you got a property line with your neighbor. But what a boundary does is it defines ownership and self-control and freedom within a relationship from the other person or the other party. So it defines the property of who I am and who I'm not, and who you are and who you're not. Well, why is that important? Well, because we get into a relationship and people forget the fence, they forget the property line, and they reach over into your yard and start trying to paint your house green. Well, you don't want your house painted green. Well, if you don't have the construction to be able to say, hey, dude, green's nice, but that's not for me. That's your deal. You do it. We have to have boundaries in order to do that. Another one is, what if they don't take care of their trees and they grow up and they don't cut them and they're falling on to your roof? We have to set limits on other people's bad behavior or irresponsible behavior, because you're reaping the consequences of what they're sowing. If a team is working together and one person's not performing, everybody's suffering, and the leader doesn't have boundaries enough to stand up and say, dude, you're not taking care of your yard, and it's affecting all of us, and it's affecting the company or a house or a home or a marriage or anything else. So a boundary is really a limit as well. So why do leaders struggle? Well, remember, boundaries exist in the context of relationship. So what if you're conflict avoidant? What if it's difficult for you to walk over to your neighbor and say, hey, buddy, your dog's eating my rabbits or whatever it is. In my house, it'd be the opposite. But it's hard for you to, confront people. Okay. You have fears, or maybe you've got a big heart and you over-identify with the struggle that somebody's had. Well, it's just hard. Let's say, you see people that I've gone in organizations before and started to look at what's going on, and I come back to the executive team and I go, what do I have to do to get fired around here? It's unbelievable. Some people that are, what are they doing? I don't know what they're, and everybody knows it because they're talking about it. But they've been here and I have literally seen teams look around the table and go, when's the last time we fired somebody? and then they'll say, especially in nonprofits or, some other, companies that want to be a family and all that, they're nice, right? And I have literally had them say, well, I think you got to either sleep with somebody or embezzle money if you want to get fired. Well, that's not protecting the yard against non-performance, against divisiveness, against people that hurt the culture. But it's hard for leaders because it's an interpersonal dynamic that gets into our back again to our own makeup. Now, I just talked about all the not being able to stand up to the bad stuff side of boundaries. The other side of boundaries is you have a lot of people who don't mind going into somebody else's yard. They have boundary problems, but the boundary problem is they can't say no to themselves, or they can't hear no from someone else. So it's just a big issue, and leaders, struggle with it. And it gets into, when you get into leadership in business, you're getting into getting people to take ownership, getting people to control what they have the ability to control and not control, people to own the power of the seat that they sit in, being able to set limits on non-performance and bad behavior and things that destroy the culture, being able to design, and this is a big deal, to design a team and to design a company in a way that augments humans' agency, their sense of agency, that they know. If I wrote a book called Boundaries for Leaders, and one of the big constructs in there, the boundaries a leader has to have, are the boundaries of what I call the control divide. Of each seat has got to be able to divide the world into, first of all, have you defined it? Here's what every person knows that they have the power to pull the lever on every day that moves the needle. What do you have control of that moves the needle that we're trying to control? That's a big deal. And when people every day are operating in every minute, moving levers that you've had your boundaries are good enough to where you've been able to let go and let them do what you hired them to do and more, where you're not controlling them, stepping into their yard all the time, and you're limiting and defining it enough so they know every single day I'm doing something that moves the needle that we care about. You're gonna have an ADD organization or team, or be scattered, or all of that. So it's a big deal.
Yeah. It's so interesting. And I love how you started with boundaries and you expanded on boundaries with multiple additional boundary series, if you will, for various aspects of life. And then you took it another step further too, talking about when is the right time to end things? How do you know when a good thing has gone bad, or when should you step out of something?
Or its season is over.
Yeah, and just that perspective is sometimes it's past that season, and it served a great time and place for a season of life, and now it's a new season.
Leaders have a hard time letting go of stuff. I was amazed, I always say I don't write books, my work writes the books, and then, I have to type it. But I'd be in the way that book came about, I'd be in the war rooms with CEOs and their teams, and it started to amaze me. These are powerful people, powerful leaders. They're not scared of, doing stuff. But how many times I'd see a powerful leader get stuck in having to end something or shut something down whose time was over. It might be a product line that why don't they throw it away? Why did it take GM 40 years to shut down Pontiac? It hadn't made a profit in 40 years. Smartest executives in the world. And you got a bankruptcy judge that shuts it down. Why? Well, because the ending that was necessary, they got stuck, and it's basically because of emotional and psychological ties to either the people or the product, or false hope that I can turn this around, or, I just, love what was a GTO? It's emotional and it's psychological, and so we humans love hope. This thing isn't working, or this person's not working, and well, I think I can turn it around, and we can do. And in the book, it talks about a diagnostic framework to know when hope really is hope versus a wish. There's a difference in hope and a wish. Hope has objective reasons for continuing to keep going with something or with somebody. In the book, I say hope spends time. Hope, if you have hope, you're going to spend more time in this. If you have hope, you're going to spend more money. If you have hope, you're going to spend more opportunity cost. Hope spends stuff. Well, we don't mind spending stuff if there's real objective reasons to have hope. Otherwise, it's just a wish. I'd hear people say, well, this, that, and the other. Well, we're hoping, our hope is next quarter is going to turn around. And I go, that's great. I hope it turns around too. Answer me a question. What is new or different that's coming next quarter that would make this any different than it is now, other than you want it to be, and you're going to try harder? Good luck. So the book's called Necessary Endings. And what that means is it's for you to get where you want to be or where you want to go, it is necessary that something end in order for that to happen. And it's kind of a sort of the biochemistry of those decisions.
As people hire you to come into their companies and help coach their team, help coach them one-on-one, and help just look at how they're doing as a business, one of the things that you are looking at is trust. And you came out with a book called Trust. Talk about how that book came about, because I know it's one of the themes of Something from the Beginning, but now is one of the books you've written.
I finally wrote the book somewhat recently. You don't get hired to come in and say, oh, we got trust issues. I've never gotten that call. I get hired in 3 scenarios. They're great and they want to do greater. Second scenario, there's a known issue or dynamic or morale or performance or culture or whatever it is. It's a known issue. Once you come help us solve this. And then the third scenario is just, about to be a fire sale, right? It's a crisis. And I've never gone into any of those scenarios. And once you open up the hood and you get down very far into it, you don't run into the issue of there's a breakdown of trust. And I mean, as simple as some people are sitting on billion-dollar companies that are much smaller than that, and they will never be what they're going to be because the leader or some of the leaders, and they wouldn't, because they're nice people, they wouldn't think they have an issue in trust. But their trust muscle is broken simply because they cannot let go of stuff that they should not be doing. And you will never scale anything without trust. Now, the problem is you trust the wrong people, you're going bankrupt. How many Starbucks are there in the world? What is it like 50,000 or something? It's a big number. Well, how do you go open up Europe if you can't truly not have to worry about who you send out there to do it. See, trust is the only way to scale anything, or you're going to be operating in a phone booth. But trust has an algorithm to it, and people make big blunders in withholding trust from people they should trust, or trusting people they shouldn't trust. And that doesn't mean you can't trust them as a person. They're not going to lie, cheat, or steal. But there's a lot of people that, you trust them with your life and have in this scenario, but you shouldn't trust them in that one. And you're not checking the boxes on all the components of trust. In the book Trust, I've got a model. I've used it in companies for 20 years probably. And to get people to look at, am I checking all the boxes before I invest in this person, or before I invest in this new product line, or invest in this new idea, or after I've done it and it's not working? Why isn't it working? The person's a genius. They're a nice person, this, that, and the other. Well, you checked 3 of the boxes, but you missed a couple. And trust is contextual, for example. I had a friend of mine, I think I put this in the book. He called me and said, hey, I need some advice. And I said, what? And he said, my daughter's boyfriend called me, wants to take me to dinner. And he said, I know what that means. He's going to ask for her hand in marriage. He said, what do you say in that conversation? I said, well, I got 2 daughters. I know what I'm going to say. He said, what? And I said, I'm going to tell him, great. And I'm going to tell him, show up with your last 2 years' tax returns and your credit report. And he starts laughing. Yeah, I said, I am as serious as sin. I am not kidding. He goes, you're not. I said, I promise you I'm going to do this. He said, that's so intrusive. I said, I don't care. He can white out the numbers. I just want to know if he can find them. Do they exist somewhere? And here's why. My daughter trusts this young man with her heart, and to care about her and be empathic and be for her and all that. Yeah, that's a couple of the boxes. But the job description of a husband is very different than the job description of a boyfriend. And I want to know if he has the ability to run a complete life, because her life is going to be connected and joined with this guy. And I don't want her going down with the ship and her heart going down with the ship. And so, it's like a company I got called in one time that do CEO coaching. And I said, well, tell me what's going on. Well, our new CEO, he's been doing it about a year, and things aren't going like, the momentum's down and it's just not. And so I went and did all the interviews, and I come back and said, so how did this happen? And they go, well, he's been here about a year as our CEO. And I said, well, how did he become the CEO? And they said, well, he was our COO for 10 years and he was awesome. I mean, he just knew distribution channels and supply chains and infrastructure, and everybody loves him. Our CEO retired, and so we made him the CEO. And I said, so where did he get the E? And they said, what do you mean? I said, he was the COO, now he's the CEO. Where did he get the E? And they said, well, we promoted him. I said, I know you put him in the chair, but where did he get the E chip that's required for that context, for that chair? And they said, well, we promoted him. I said, here's what I see. I see a company that's being operated really well, but it's not being led. So you could trust him with your life in one context, but you haven't asked the question, are the real abilities that are going to be required from that seat, can we trust him with that? And so trust is an algorithm. What I did when I wrote the book is I went through all the, trust literature in the universe on psychologically and business and deals and failures of deals and in all of it, and kind of did a factor analysis of all these thousands of articles and books and all this. If you factor analyze them, what are you talking about? And really, there's 5 components that they all, if you do a regression analysis on it, they all, the covariance, really, you're talking about 5 things, not a million things. And then, the neurology and psychology and relationship stuff of how all that works. That's what the book's about. And what I'd love to do with teams and companies is to get them to work through the paradigm in looking at how not only they work, but how they're running everything. And it's really powerful. Trust, the construct of trust is really powerful.
Yeah, I'm going to make sure, because I think people have already read Boundaries, Necessary Endings. Hopefully people have seen Trust, but we're going to add that link so that people can especially find that, and a link to your site when we actually go to publish this too. One thing I'm curious, you wrote a book that was, I'm not sure if it felt off topic for you or perfectly on topic, but called
I didn't know there was a topic, so I can't be off topic. So seriously, I've never had a plan for this. It's the work writes the books, and it's just how I just try how things work, and something will stand out.
So how did Why I Believe come about?
Oh, no, that one is off topic. I'm a person of faith. I'm a believer in Jesus, and I have a lot of friends that know that, and it's like, yeah, you're one of those. And a lot of people in business, because I work in public companies, right? They're not going to church every day in a business, and they, you Google me, it's going to come up. I had a guy one time from one of the Hollywood studios who were doing a project, and we had 2 meetings and everything's going well. And he comes in the third one, he's looking at me like weird. I said, "What's wrong?" He says, "You're one of those." I said, "One of what?" And he says, "I Googled you." And he said, "A 19-foot spinning Jesus comes up over your head," meaning all of this faith stuff. He goes, "What is?" I said, "I thought you were a real doctor." I said, "I am. I have a license." But yeah, I'm a person of faith. And so it's a hard thing to talk about, really. Well, it can be divisive, or people think you're crazy, or, what about all of this? And so I just have so many friends that we never really talked about how I can be one of those weirdos. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to write a book. This is why I believe this stuff. And I wrote it to be able to give to my friends. That's why I wrote it. And basically it's not theory. It's my story. How, there's a verse in the Bible where Jesus heals somebody, and he comes back and starts telling people about it in their passage. And they go, "Well, who, what?" They're asking this question. He goes, "Look, I don't know. I can't explain all this. All I know is I was blind and now I see." And so that's kind of my story. It was when I hit bottom a long time ago in college, and how the subtitle of the book, it's a psychologist's thoughts on suffering, miracles, science, and faith. And I was in deep pain. Life wasn't working. And I reached out to God, and miraculous things started happening. I found out I cannot deny that he's real. Wow. Well, and then all the healing that happened, and the way he brought me from the gutter. But then that brought up a lot of intellectual questions. And so that's why it's suffering, miracles, science, and faith, because I get into the big intellectual quandaries about how does all this go together. So I could get my friends so they know, you might be weird, but at least you're not crazy, And that's where the book came from.
Oh, well, Henry, I want to hit you with 10 rapid fire questions where you just say the very first thing that comes to your mind.
B.
All right. B is the right answer.
Have you ever seen that video?
Yeah, I've seen that video. Yeah, I feel like during COVID, that was going around like crazy.
It was. For those of you who don't know, it's just this old man, and he's sitting there, and they're going to ask him a question. He's waiting, and they go, "Okay, you have two choices. A, you can spend the rest of your life with your wife." And he goes, "B." So my wife and I have a joke now. So what do you want to do for dinner? You want to go here? And they go, B. We always say that. So B. I'll choose B on the rapid fire.
All right. Well, first one is, who's the first person you think of when I say servant leadership?
A, I think of so many, and B, a bunch of them are clients, and so I can't mention their names. But I'd kind of like to put the question on everybody when you just ask yourself this question. Who have you ever been led by when you saw that, wow, it's really not about them. Everything they do is about something bigger than themselves or the people or the stakeholders. There is one that I could say, because this comes up a lot, in leadership circles that I find myself start talking about leaders. So I've worked with Chick-fil-A for a long time, and Tim Tassopoulos, if anybody looks up Tim Tassopoulos, one of the greatest examples. He was the sort of, all those years when Dan was the CEO, and Tim was more in the operational, leadership side of it. You can tell a leader from their wake, the wake they leave behind them. And you talk to people in people's wake who worked in their wake for a long time. And one of the things that they always, everybody says about the most respected and the most loved leader they ever worked for. So that is one. I could say that. Even though he's not famous, but you could look him up and.
That's a good one. All right. 5 words that describe you.
Scattered. I think the biggest word would be curious. I've always kind of had this, how's that work? This kind of, is it okay if I just do two, curious and scattered?
Yeah.
The reason I say scattered.
This is a deep question because you think of a lot of things all of a sudden. All right. Favorite author or book?
Oh, come on. You can't really do this. You can't get it. It's like saying, okay, air, water, or food. Which one?
You got to choose one.
Otto Kernberg. And if I had to pick one book, Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism.
All right. Favorite movie?
Being There.
I'll check it out. All right. Favorite food?
Italian.
Favorite thing to do in your free time?
Play golf. Why would anybody do anything else?
All right. A surprising fact about you.
I spent prom night in jail. You shouldn't be drag racing in between prom and after prom. What was the last one?
Favorite place you've been? Prague
or the Amalfi Coast.
All right. Is there anywhere you want to go that you have not been to before?
Asleep.
All right. And the final question is, what's the best advice you've ever gotten?
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths.
Wow. That is so good. Well, Henry, I can't say thank you enough. You have inspired me and our company over a decade. And I'm so thankful for you personally, and I'm grateful that our audience gets to hear from you as well.
Well, thank you. It's been so much fun to talk to you. I love what y'all are doing, and I'll just have to tell everybody, go tune in.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Servant Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give it a thumbs up, and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Be sure to check out the servantleadershippodcast.org for more updates and additional bonus content.